"You're not welcome at Mother's Day this year," my daughter-in-law said calmly across the kitchen counter, as if she were reminding me about the weather. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. The words hung in the air between us, quiet but heavy, like the slow ticking of a clock in an empty room. I stood there holding the pie dish I had just taken out of the oven, the warm scent of cinnamon and baked apples filling the kitchen I had cooked in for more than 30 years. Mother's Day had always been a small tradition in our family. Nothing fancy, just lunch at the house, the same old oak table, a few flowers in a glass vase, and my son Daniel pretending he remembered to buy a card at the last minute. But this year Ashley had decided things would be different. "We're keeping it small," she added, wiping a spotless counter with a paper towel that didn't need wiping. Daniel stood near the refrigerator with his arms folded, staring down at the tile floor like he had suddenly discovered something fascinating about it. He didn't say a word. My son had always been quiet, but silence can feel very loud when you're waiting for someone to speak. I looked at him for a moment, hoping he might laugh and say Ashley was joking. He didn't. The kitchen window above the sink looked out toward the backyard where my late husband, Thomas, had planted a maple tree the year Daniel turned 10. It was tall now, its leaves moving gently in the spring breeze. I set the pie on the counter and wiped my hands on a dish towel. "I see," I said. My voice sounded calm, even to me. Ashley gave a small nod, the kind people give when they believe a conversation is finished. "We're having brunch at the restaurant downtown," she said. "It'll just be immediate family." Immediate family. I had once believed that included me. I picked up my purse from the chair by the door. The house felt strangely quiet, though the refrigerator hummed and a lawn mower buzzed faintly somewhere down the street. I walked past Daniel, close enough to smell the coffee on his breath. For a second I thought he might stop me. He didn't. Outside, the air was cool and bright, the kind of May morning that makes the world look freshly washed. I got into my car and sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel. The pie was still sitting on the kitchen counter inside, cooling beside the vase of tulips I had bought the night before. After a minute, I started the engine and drove away. I didn't cry. At 68, you learn that tears rarely change anything. Instead, the next morning, I went to the bank. And that, as it turned out, was the part Ashley never expected. The bank opened at 9 o'clock that morning, but I arrived 10 minutes early and waited in my car across the street, watching the glass doors as the first employees unlocked them and stepped inside. The building had been there for decades, a modest brick structure with a flag that moved slowly in the mild spring breeze. I had driven past it thousands of times over the years, but that morning it felt different, as if the place held an answer I had been waiting for without realizing it. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of traffic on the road. The radio was playing softly, some cheerful song about summer, but it sounded distant and unimportant. My mind kept drifting back to the kitchen the day before, to Ashley's calm voice and the way Daniel had stared at the floor as if silence were the safest place to hide. I had raised Daniel in that house. I had bandaged his scraped knees when he fell from his bicycle on the driveway. I had stayed awake through long nights when he was sick with fever. I had cheered at every school concert and every baseball game, even the ones played under a cold drizzle in early April. The house had been the center of all those memories. Thomas used to say that a home is not just walls and furniture. It is time. It is laughter. It is the quiet understanding that the people inside belong to one another. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the bank, the cool air brushing gently against my face. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paper. A young teller greeted me with a polite smile, but I asked to speak with the branch manager. After a few minutes, a tall man in a navy suit came out from a small office and shook my hand warmly. His name was Michael Grant, and he had helped Thomas and me with our accounts many times over the years. He recognized me immediately. We sat down at a small round table near the window, sunlight falling across the surface in bright squares. He asked how I had been doing since Thomas passed away last year. I told him that some days were quiet, but quiet was not always a bad thing. Then I explained that I needed to review a certain document that had been placed in our safe deposit box years ago. Michael nodded and led me through a secure hallway into the vault. The metal door closed behind us with a heavy sound that echoed softly through the room. He retrieved the box and set it in front of me, giving me privacy as he stepped away. I opened it slowly. Inside were a few old papers, a small envelope, and a folded document I had not looked at in a long time. I ran my fingers along the edge of the paper and remembered the afternoon Thomas had insisted we come here together. He had been very calm that day, unusually thoughtful, as if he were arranging something important far in advance. At the time I had trusted him completely, the way you trust someone who has shared your life for more than 40 years. Now, sitting in that quiet vault with the document resting in my hands, I understood something Ashley did not, and perhaps something Daniel had never thought to ask. I unfolded the document slowly, careful with the edges as if the paper itself carried the weight of the years behind it. The vault was quiet except for the faint echo of footsteps somewhere beyond the heavy door. For a long moment, I simply stared at the page, letting my eyes adjust to the familiar handwriting and signatures. Thomas had always been very particular about details. Even when we were young, when money was tight and Daniel was still small enough to fall asleep on the living room carpet while cartoons played on television, Thomas would sit at the kitchen table late at night reviewing bills and documents with a calm patience that I admired. He believed that preparation was a kind of protection. At the time I thought he was simply being cautious. Now I understood he had been planning far more carefully than I ever realized. The document in my hands carried both of our names, dated nearly 12 years earlier, long before Ashley had entered Daniel's life. I remembered the day clearly once the memory returned. It had been a bright autumn afternoon, leaves scattered across the sidewalk outside the bank as Thomas held the door open for me. He had been unusually thoughtful that day, speaking slowly as if choosing every word. He said that families sometimes changed in ways people did not expect. He said that kindness should always be offered, but security should never be forgotten. At the time I laughed and told him he worried too much. Thomas simply smiled in that quiet way he had when he believed time would eventually prove him right. I traced the signature at the bottom of the document with my finger. The ink had faded slightly, but it was unmistakably his. The language was clear, written in the careful style lawyers prefer when they want to remove all possible confusion. Ownership of the house remained entirely under my authority unless I personally decided otherwise. No transfer could occur without my written consent. No sale could happen without my approval. Even after Thomas passed away, the control remained exactly where he intended it to remain. I leaned back in the chair and allowed myself a slow breath. Somewhere upstairs a printer hummed softly, followed by the quiet ring of a telephone. Ordinary sounds from the world above the vault. I folded the document again and placed it back into the envelope. For the first time since yesterday morning, a small smile appeared at the corner of my mouth. Ashley had spoken with such confidence in the kitchen, as if the future had already been arranged neatly in her favor. She believed the house belonged to Daniel now. She believed that time would slowly push me aside until moving away seemed like the natural next step. But sitting there in the quiet vault with Thomas's careful planning resting in my hands, I realized something important. Some people speak as if they control the story. Others simply wait until the right page arrives. I placed the document back into the envelope and closed the safe deposit box with steady hands, sliding it across the small metal table. Before calling Michael Grant back into the vault, he returned with the same polite professionalism he had shown for years, and together we locked the box away again behind the heavy steel door. As we walked back through the quiet hallway toward the lobby, the morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting bright reflections across the polished floor. Michael asked if everything was in order, and I told him that it was. In truth, everything had been in order for a very long time. I simply had not needed to look at the proof until now. Outside, the day had grown warmer, the kind of clear May morning that made the trees along the street look especially green and alive. I sat in my car for a few minutes before starting the engine, letting the quiet settle around me. The document rested safely where it belonged, and the certainty it gave me felt surprisingly calm rather than dramatic. Thomas had always believed that the strongest plans were the ones that did not need to be explained. I drove home slowly through the familiar neighborhood, passing the small grocery store where Daniel used to beg for chocolate milk after Little League practice, and the park where he once insisted he could climb the tallest oak tree without help. Parenting often feels like a long collection of small moments that disappear before you notice they are gone. When Daniel was young, the house had been full of noise. Soccer cleats left by the door, backpacks dropped on the hallway floor, the the sound of laughter drifting through the kitchen while dinner cooked on the stove. Thomas used to sit at the end of the table listening quietly, sometimes smiling in that thoughtful way of his as if he were memorizing everything. I realized now that he probably was. When Ashley first came into Daniel's life, I had welcomed her the same way I had welcomed every friend of his over the years. I believed kindness was the easiest way to begin any relationship. She had been polite then, bright and confident, the sort of person who spoke quickly and seemed to understand how to organize everything around her. At first I admired that confidence. But over time, small things began to change in ways that were difficult to describe. Family dinners slowly became shorter. Conversations felt more careful, as if certain topics had quietly disappeared from the table. And whenever decisions were mentioned about the house or the future, Ashley spoke with a certainty that suggested she had already imagined how the story would end. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. The maple tree Thomas planted years ago swayed gently above the yard, its leaves catching the afternoon sunlight. For a long moment I sat there looking at the house, the same house Ashley believed would soon become hers to shape and control. Then I stepped out of the car, walked up the path, and unlocked the front door with the same key I had carried for decades, fully aware that the truth resting in that vault had quietly changed everything. I stepped inside the house and closed the door gently behind me, the quiet of the hallway wrapping around me like a familiar blanket. The same framed photographs still lined the wall, moments from a lifetime that had once felt simple and certain. Daniel at 8 years old holding a fishing pole twice his size, grinning proudly beside Thomas at the edge of a small lake. A Christmas morning where wrapping paper covered the entire living room floor. A summer barbecue in the backyard where friends and neighbors filled the air with laughter while Thomas stood beside the grill pretending he was a professional chef. Those pictures had never changed, even as the people inside them slowly had. I set my purse on the small table near the stairs and walked into the kitchen. The apple pie from yesterday still rested on the counter where I had left it. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and butter, the same comforting scent that had greeted Daniel after school for years. I placed the pie in the refrigerator and then stood by the window for a moment, looking out toward the maple tree swaying quietly in the yard. It occurred to me that Ashley had always moved through this house with the confidence of someone who believed time was on her side. She spoke often about future renovations, about opening walls, modernizing rooms, and turning the guest bedroom into something she called a home office. She said these things casually, usually when Daniel was nearby, as if the changes were simply waiting for the right moment to begin. Daniel rarely argued. He would nod slowly, sometimes glancing toward me, in a way that suggested he believed everyone would eventually agree. I never corrected them. Not once. Instead, I listened. I watched the rhythm of their plans the same way Thomas once watched the details of our accounts and documents. Some people assume silence means weakness. In truth, silence often means patience. Later that afternoon, I brewed a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table where sunlight spread across the wood in long golden lines. The house felt peaceful again, the kind of calm that returns after a storm passes quietly without rain. My phone buzzed once against the table. A new message appeared from Daniel. He wrote that brunch had been nice and that the restaurant downtown had been very crowded because of the holiday. He asked if I had enjoyed a quiet day at home. I read the message twice and then set the phone back down without answering. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street, its tires humming against the pavement. The world continued in its usual steady rhythm. But somewhere between yesterday morning and this quiet afternoon, a very small but very important understanding had settled into place. Ashley believed she had already reached the final chapter of this story. She believed the house, the decisions, and the future all moved naturally toward her control. What she did not know was that Thomas had written a very different ending long before she ever walked through the front door. I washed the teacup and placed it carefully on the rack beside the sink, listening to the soft clink of porcelain against metal. The afternoon moved slowly through the house, carried by the quiet rhythm of sunlight shifting across the kitchen floor. For the first time in many months, the silence did not feel lonely. It felt clear. Outside, a breeze moved through the maple tree, sending small shadows dancing across the window above the sink. I stood there for a while watching the leaves move, remembering how Thomas used to say that time reveals people the same way wind reveals the shape of a tree. Slowly. Naturally. Without anyone needing to force it. Around 4 o'clock, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Ashley. Her message was short and cheerful in the way people write when they assume everything is going exactly as they planned. She said the restaurant had been lovely, and that Daniel had ordered pancakes even though it was nearly noon. She added that they might stop by later in the week to talk about a few things concerning the house. I could almost hear her voice in the words. Confident. Organized. Already thinking 3 steps ahead. For a long moment, I looked at the message without replying. Then I placed the phone face down on the table and walked into the living room. The late afternoon light filled the space gently, touching the old furniture Thomas and I had chosen together more than 3 decades ago. The blue armchair by the window still held the slight indentation where he used to sit with his newspaper every morning. I ran my hand along the back of it and allowed myself a quiet smile. Thomas had always believed that the most important plans were the ones no one noticed until the moment they mattered. That afternoon, I opened the small desk drawer near the bookshelf and took out a notepad. I wrote down the phone number for our attorney, Robert Hastings, the same man who had helped Thomas prepare the documents years earlier. I had not spoken with him since the funeral, but I suspected he would remember us. I dialed the number and waited while the line rang twice before his assistant answered. Her voice was warm and professional, and when I explained who I was, she immediately said that Mr. Hastings would be happy to speak with me. A few minutes later, his familiar voice came through the receiver, steady and calm. We spoke for several minutes about ordinary things at first. The weather, the neighborhood, the way time had passed since Thomas left us. Then I mentioned that I had reviewed the document in the safe deposit box earlier that morning. There was a short pause on the line, the kind that happens when someone understands exactly what you are referring to. Mr. Hastings said that everything Thomas had arranged remained exactly as it was written. Nothing had changed. Nothing could change without my direct decision. I thanked him and ended the call with a sense of quiet certainty. Across town, Ashley was probably imagining future renovations and new furniture placements inside a house she believed was slowly becoming hers. Meanwhile, the evening sun slipped lower behind the maple tree outside my window, and for the first time since yesterday morning, I felt something steady settle in my chest. Some stories take time before the truth reaches the right page. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of calm weekday that often follows a busy holiday. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains as I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the same wooden table where Daniel had done his homework years ago. The house felt steady again, almost thoughtful, as if it understood that something important had shifted. I read the newspaper slowly, not because the headlines interested me very much, but because routine has a way of bringing clarity. Outside, a delivery truck stopped briefly across the street, and somewhere a dog barked once before settling down again. Life in the neighborhood continued exactly as it always had. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I answered after the second ring. His voice sounded relaxed, the way people sound when they believe nothing serious is waiting for them. He asked how I had been feeling and whether I had enjoyed the quiet day yesterday. I told him that the house had been peaceful. There was a short pause before he mentioned that Ashley had been thinking about stopping by sometime this week. He explained that she had some ideas about the house and wanted to talk them through with me. I could hear a careful tone in his voice, as though he hoped the conversation would move smoothly without disagreement. I told him that they were welcome to visit whenever they liked. The simplicity of the answer seemed to surprise him slightly, and his voice brightened with relief. After we hung up, I finished my coffee and carried the empty cup to the sink. Through the window, I watched the maple tree again, its leaves shifting gently in the soft wind. I had spent many years believing that patience meant waiting for problems to disappear. Thomas had always understood that patience was something else entirely. It was the ability to watch events unfold without rushing to interrupt them. Later that afternoon, I walked through the house slowly, noticing details the way one notices familiar photographs after years of passing them by, without looking closely. The living room still held the same quiet dignity Thomas had loved. The hallway carried the faint scent of old books and polished wood. Even the staircase creaked in the same places it had when Daniel used to race up it 2 steps at a time. This house had never belonged to ambition or plans or new designs drawn on scrap paper. It belonged to time itself. By early evening, I heard the distant sound of a car slowing on the street outside. I did not rush to the window. I already knew whose car it would be. The engine stopped, followed by the quiet slam of two doors. Footsteps approached along the walkway. A moment later the doorbell rang once, clear and confident. I walked to the door and opened it calmly. Daniel stood there with a polite smile, while Ashley beside him held a folder tucked under her arm, as if she were arriving for an important meeting. Her eyes moved briefly across the living room behind me, measuring the space the same way she often did when imagining her future changes. "We thought we would talk about the house," she said with the bright certainty of someone who believed the conversation had already been decided. I stepped aside and welcomed them in, already aware that the evening would unfold very differently from the story Ashley believed she was about to tell. Daniel and Ashley stepped into the living room as if they were arriving for a small presentation rather than a family visit. Ashley moved with quiet confidence, glancing around the room the way someone studies a space they intend to redesign. She walked slowly toward the sofa, while Daniel remained near the doorway for a moment before joining her. I closed the front door behind them and gestured toward the chairs near the coffee table. The evening light filled the room gently, soft and calm, the same light that had passed through these windows for more than 30 years. Ashley placed the folder she carried onto the table and opened it carefully. Inside were several printed pages and what appeared to be a rough floor plan drawn with colored markers. She smiled in a polite, professional way, the way someone might smile before beginning a meeting at work. "Daniel and I have been thinking about the future," she began, sliding one of the papers toward me. "This house has a lot of potential if a few changes are made." I looked down at the paper without touching it. The drawing showed the kitchen wall removed, the dining room expanded, and the small guest bedroom upstairs turned into what she had labeled a home office. Ashley spoke with enthusiasm as she described each idea, her finger moving across the page as if the changes had already been approved. Daniel nodded beside her, occasionally adding a small comment about how nice the space would feel once everything was modernized. I listened quietly, allowing the conversation to unfold at its own pace. The room remained peaceful, filled only with Ashley's steady voice and the faint sound of the maple leaves moving outside the window. When she finished explaining the layout, Ashley leaned back slightly and folded her hands. "Of course," she continued, "all of this would be easier once the house officially transfers to Daniel. Then we can begin the renovations and make everything more practical for the future." Daniel glanced toward me briefly, perhaps expecting some reaction, but I simply rested my hands in my lap and studied the paper on the table. The drawing looked neat and confident, as though it had been prepared by someone certain that time itself supported her plans. Ashley reached for another page in the folder. This one appeared to be an estimate from a contractor. She placed it beside the drawing with a small sense of accomplishment. "We wanted to show you the possibilities," she said. "It would be a wonderful change for everyone." I allowed a quiet moment to pass before speaking. The house seemed to hold its breath in the stillness. Outside, the sun had lowered behind the maple tree, casting long shadows across the living room floor. I reached for the paper at last and studied the drawing for a few seconds before placing it gently back onto the table. Then I stood and walked toward the small desk near the bookshelf where I had placed a single envelope earlier that afternoon. I picked it up and returned to the coffee table, setting it calmly beside Ashley's plans. The envelope was plain and unremarkable, the sort of thing that rarely draws attention. Yet the moment it touched the table, Ashley's confident smile faded slightly, as if some small part of her understood that the story she had been explaining was about to take an unexpected turn. Ashley looked down at the envelope on the table as if it were an unexpected object that had somehow appeared in the middle of her carefully prepared plans. For a moment she did not touch it. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, his eyes moving from the envelope to my face as though he were trying to understand why the atmosphere in the room had changed so quietly. I sat down again across from them and folded my hands in my lap. The living room felt unusually still, the kind of calm that arrives just before an important sentence is spoken. Ashley cleared her throat softly and forced a polite smile. "What is this?" she asked, glancing at the envelope again. Her voice still carried confidence, but the certainty from earlier had begun to soften around the edges. I nodded toward it. "You should open it," I said gently. She hesitated only a second before sliding the envelope toward herself and lifting the flap. Inside were several pages, neatly folded. She pulled them out and unfolded the top sheet, her eyes moving quickly across the printed lines. At first her expression remained neutral. Then something shifted. It was subtle, but noticeable. The confidence in her posture faded as she read more carefully, her eyes returning to the first paragraph again, as though she wanted to make sure the words said exactly what they appeared to say. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What is it?" he asked. Ashley did not answer immediately. Her eyes continued scanning the document, and I could see the exact moment when the meaning fully settled in. She placed the page slowly back on the table. The room remained silent except for the faint sound of the maple leaves brushing against the window outside. Daniel reached for the document and began reading it himself. His brow tightened as he followed the lines across the page. The paper explained something very simple. Ownership of the house had never transferred after Thomas passed away. The authority remained exactly where it had always been placed years earlier. Every decision concerning the property required my direct approval. Nothing about that arrangement had changed. Not yesterday, not last year, not even after Thomas was gone. Daniel lowered the paper slowly and looked at me with an expression that was part confusion and part realization. Ashley sat perfectly still, her hands resting on the folder that held her renovation plans. I allowed the silence to sit between us for a moment before speaking again. My voice remained calm, the way Thomas used to speak when he wanted every word to be clear. "Your plans are very detailed," I said, glancing briefly at the drawings she had prepared. "But the house does not belong to Daniel." I paused just long enough for the truth to settle completely in the quiet room. Then I looked directly at Ashley and offered the same gentle smile she had given me the day before in the kitchen. "It still belongs to me."